Hello! Welcome to Webtoon Genius. I'm your host, Dr. Emily Hall, and today we are going to talk with Melissa Pagluica, who is the creator of the webtoon Monster Heart on Webtoon Canvas and the webcomic turned print comic Above the Clouds. In this episode, we will be discussing her artistic works and inspirations, as well as the transition process from webcomics to webtoons and back again to print comics. Come and join us for an exploration into webtoons. Hello, Melissa, and welcome to Webtoon Genius.
Hello! Thanks for having me.
It is so great having you on, and I absolutely love your work. So, to begin with, I wanted to talk about how you got started on Webtoon Canvas.
Sure. So I had done a web comic before, Above the Clouds, and when I did that, I had my own website and I was doing it by like a traditional comic page. But when Webtoons came out, I was really intrigued with the vertical format, and so for me, being on Webtoon Canvas was sort of a bucket list item. I'm like, oh, I always wanted to have a story up there and try out how does like really utilize the vertical format, and it feels more true to experiencing a webcomic online where you get to really enjoy like the scrolling aspect and how that plays with timing and how someone like really visualizes the story unfold. And so when I decided to do my next story, I definitely wanted to still do a printed version because I love books, and even stories that are on webtoons, there's a few that are on there where I'm very frustrated where I love the story and I'm like, I need a printed version of this. I want to hold it and like consume it like in a physical format. But so I created Monster Heart and I released it first on my Patreon as traditional pages. And then once I finished the entire story, which is 60 pages, if you were to have like a physical book of it, I went back and decided to reformat all of the pages into a new vertical format. And that's sort of part of the reason why I went on Webtoons, because that was where I was first introduced to the idea of really wanting to explore telling a story, in a format that's not just flipping a page.
I would like to pause on that thought of webcomic versus webtoon formatting for later on in the interview. So, for now, how about tell a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I am a full-time illustrator, and I used to I would go around to conventions selling my work. And I started as an illustrator, just trying to tell a story within one image. And it got to a point where, because I'm a huge book reader and I love stories so much, I'm like, I need to tell a longer story, and one image is not enough. And it wasn't really until after college where, it clicked for me, right, there's this thing called sequential art. You could tie many pictures, single images together. So I knew I wanted to make a comic, and I wanted to like really understand like how a story was put together. And for a while, I had one story idea that I really liked. However, I realized it was going on a year, and nothing was really happening. I wasn't really creating pages. I had like dialogue written out, I had some descriptions written out, I was making like single images for it, character sheets, but like not actual pages. And I realized I had made the project way too precious. You get to a point where I guess you're like, I want to make this epic, great comic, but it becomes like this giant mountain that you're afraid to climb, and it makes it really hard to get the ball rolling. And so I put that story to this, as painful it was, I put it to the side, and I'm like, okay, I need to put some boundaries for myself And I realized that the important thing is that I need to learn how to make a comic in order, to really understand the medium, to tell a story with it. And so I gave the rule that I can't be precious, like I can't be perfect and try to make it some grand thing. And as long as I'm getting one page done, then it's already a success, because that means that that is one page more than zero. And I really sat with that for a bit. And I remember it was this moment when I was at a holiday event with my family, and I got my phone out and I wrote this line: a boy gives a girl a book. And it was really simple, not extravagant, but I really loved the imagery of what that evoked, this idea of someone giving someone a book. And it's like, why would they give them a book? And who's this person giving them this book? And I think because it was so simple, it allowed my mind to just ask why? Why is this happening? Why is it moving forward? And the next day, after writing that line, I drew out a couple character sheets, and I'm like, I like these characters. And the day after that, I drew out 2 pages. I drew out 2 pages for this comic, and I go, I think this is actually flowing. It's going somewhere. And I just didn't stop. That was the beginning of Above the Clouds. And I started out putting it as a webcomic with the idea that if I'm posting up a page, then it kind of puts this expectation out there for people. Like if I get someone to follow it and they're like, what's the next page? It feels like there's more urgency, or like I'm putting it out there in the universe. I'm making a page. It's here. It exists. And so it making myself more responsible to start creating the habit of making weekly pages. And that's what I think is awesome about webcomics is, being able to put something out every week and build something up slowly. So that's how Above the Clouds started.
I find it interesting that you try to make Above the Clouds not epic, but I feel you still manage to make it epic in its own small way.
Well, it started as a small story. I swear I was trying to make a short story. And then 5 years later.
Well, it is the curse of the author. You start off small and then...
Perhaps because of that simplicity, though, not only did it get the ball rolling, but I think I was able to create a story that I otherwise never would have allowed myself to create, because I was so busy trying to make something perfect and polished. And I with Above the Clouds, I really grew with this comic because it was my first comic story, learning how to put these pages together, understanding, building up a consistent habit in routine. There we go. A consistent routine of what it takes to make a single page. And it took me 6 months to come out with the first chapter of Above the Clouds. And after that, because of how much I was growing and becoming more comfortable and learning more tools, I was able to get faster, and that went down to 4 months. And then it went down to 3 months getting a chapter out. And with Above the Clouds, it started with that one sentence, and then I saw the whole story sort of play out like a music video in my mind. And so I knew how it was going to end. And so I created the skeleton of an outline for the story, knowing that these story beats were going to happen. And Above the Clouds was very fly by the seat of my pants, though I'm mentioning that there is an outline. So I knew these beats were going to happen, but I didn't know the in-between space of how they were going to go from one to the next. Because as I was making myself make sure I get these pages out, I was sort of creating the story as I was going. And then as I got more comfortable, I was able to plan way more in advance than when I first started. And then I would outline, or I wouldn't have an outline just for the entire story, knowing how it was going to end. I would start making an outline for the individual chapters where I could become a little bit more being able to plan better, I guess, as I was coming out with the pages, hopefully trying to tell a tighter story.
That is some excellent advice for people who are just starting and trying to create their own story outline. So, speaking of Above the Clouds, one of the things I enjoyed was that it was both poetic and has, as you said, this sort of musical, lyrical quality to it within the artwork itself. This is especially seen in the characters within the regular world who have no voice. So you see everything through Cian and Eileen's words and exchanges. Everything else is in pantomime. And it creates this very unique experience where the reader is challenged to fill in the dialogue based solely on the expressions and imagery evoked. And I'm not sure if I've ever read anything quite like it. Therefore, I would like it if you could talk about the interaction between the real and the imaginary world within Above the Clouds.
So the half silent part is twofold because I had some specific goals of wanting to be able to tell a story as clear as possible without having to use dialogue. The idea that someone can just look at the page and not feel confused about what they're looking at was just something I had to grow. And I know I think didn't get it right all the time, but through this project, that was one of my goals that I gave myself, was like just being able to be as clear as possible. I wasn't adding more information in there that wasn't necessary. I wanted someone's eyes to feel happy or comfortable looking at the page, so they didn't like feel overwhelmed when they were like their eyes were flowing through it. And the other part was that, you know, dialogue is its own art form. I'm more comfortable with the art aspect, but writing out dialogue and text is something that I'm still trying to grow and become better at. And so this was also a way for it to not feel overwhelming for me. Taking on this project was not trying to master the perfect dialogue. And one of the things I love about illustration, or the things I always look for, is oftentimes I think when people are looking at artwork, they tend to project things that are going on in their own life. So you'll have two people look at the same painting and come away with different experiences depending on where they're coming from or what they decide to focus on. And I think people's minds love the ability to fill in the blank. And so I was hoping through Eileen's story, the silent aspect, that people would enjoy that feeling of like they know what's happening through their interactions and body languages, but the words aren't necessarily needed to be conveyed, and people could fill in what they think they would be saying during those portions. And then I don't know if you noticed, but the caretaker, so this is in the book that Eileen's given, the main character is a caretaker. It looks kind of like a hooded figure, and they're called like the people of the sky. That's what they're referenced as. And all of them have no faces. And I did that intentionally, as the book world does have words and dialogue to contrast Eileen's world. So Eileen has to rely on facial expressions and on body language. And in the book world, there is words and text. And I thought it was appropriate to contrast that with a character that has no facial expressions. Yeah, so that was sort of the thought process behind crafting these two worlds happening next to each other as the story unfolds.
That is fascinating. I feel that I understand the story even more now, and I'm going to look at it completely different the next time I see it. So, when I was reading it, I felt like Above the Clouds was a story for authors and their creativity. So, for an author, the world around them can sometimes feel silent, and what matters is the world inside their head and the stories that come out. Consequently, the outside world can, also affect the stories within one's head and cause changes in the story you're creating. Then, in the end, possibly because of how they can affect one another, what's within one's head sometimes can feel more real, more tangible, and even sometimes more vocal than what is actually going on around you.
Oh, yeah, to have the book world feel sometimes more alive than the world that you're in, or you want to live in that world so it feels more colorful and more alive. I mean, in my own life, that's definitely it was something that helped me get through a lot of things was reading books. And that kind of got mirrored in with Eiley, who, as you read the story, you see that she doesn't have the best relationship with her mom, and her mom's comparing her to her older sister, and her mom wants her to be this perfect lady, but all she wants to do is draw and make these worlds, and you could see see these conflicts, and so yeah, I wanted that same feeling that you were saying about like being able to get lost in the world that you're reading about or creating. And that's kind of part of where the title of the book comes from, playing on the idea of head in the clouds. And so above the clouds was sort of alluding to what happens in the story in the end, but a place that you're trying to get towards as a creator making stories, not just being in the clouds, but to see something, come out of
Above the
that.
clouds.
Yeah.
Since we're on the subject of authors, I'm curious what other works might have inspired you in creating Above the Clouds? Now, I can tell you one work that really came to mind when I was reading, and that was The Neverending Story, which also has that sort of dual layer of the reader and the story, and which is similar to the author in the story in Above the Clouds, and how those narratives intertwined. And there was also, this one scene where the caretaker and Rata are going through the bog, and Rata is consumed by the darkness. And I suddenly was transported into the never ending story with the bog and the death of the horse. And it drummed up so many of those memories I had when I was a child and
Yeah.
watching it. And and I felt very emotional reading that part
Yes.
because I remember how much I cried when I was a child when that horse died.
Yes. I was super emotional. Neverending Story definitely had a big impact on me. Not only just with the story, but I don't know if you noticed stylistically wise in that movie, there's this whimsical softness. Even when you have like really dark scenes, there's like this contrast with like a forest that's around it, or the colors that they have around the Empress, or the very beginning scene when they're on that floating thing. There's like not too many movies I feel like really utilize or are not afraid to use pastels in their atmospheres. I mean, I feel like I'm seeing a lot more nowadays. I feel like I see a lot of more subtle colors. But another big inspiration was The Last Unicorn. There was like this sense of sadness when you watch the cartoon or even read the book. There's like the sadness that's overhead where you know that they're going to meet going towards their quest and they might achieve it, but there's like something that's almost sacrifice or a level a feeling of pain, I guess, that sort of bittersweetness. And I that feeling always stayed with me with that cartoon. The same as with I don't know if you remember the Sea Prince and the Fire Child. It was like a really old 80s beautiful music, and it was sort of like their kind of rendition of Romeo and Juliet, but it was like the Water Kingdom and the Fire Kingdom, but it had the same feeling of like the sadness that's sort of like looming. And I guess to me as a kid, because you experience things and family and things that you face, you feel the weight of that. And even though you're escaping into these different worlds, it feels grounding to have characters that understand, I guess, some of that sadness. And it makes it easy to want to jump on board and follow a character has experienced some of it as well, I guess.
That is true. Now, this is one of the reasons why people read stories, as well as why people want representation of themselves within stories, because they want to understand and also connect to the story. If you don't have connections, then it's hard to relate to the story. And you could see this within Above the Clouds, that it is very relatable to creative people at sort of a fundamental level because it speaks to that creative process. And it is also relatable to people in general because of the losses later in the story. Because, most people have experienced some type of tragedy or loss sometime within their lives. So, while I was initially drawn to Above the Clouds because of the fabulous artistry, I grew to love it even more because of the multiple layers and dimensions to the story.
What's funny is, like, with Above the Clouds, sometimes when you're making like worlds or creating a story, you don't really intend to put themes in, or you don't intend to put things in, but it tends to like unconsciously weave its way into the worlds, because like all those characters in a sense are a part of you in some way, or really trying to relate to characters in that situation. And so it's funny how that happens, where you don't even mean to put something in and it still finds its way.
It's the creative process. One of the things that is often brought up in literary analysis is author intent versus reader reception. The crutch of the matter is that sometimes authors do not intentionally put things in their stories, but unintentionally do so because it's, in the back of your mind. It's like the backdrop of your life. Now, returning to potential inspirations, how would you say that your experience making Above the Clouds influenced Monster Heart?
I will say, being able to think about how a page is drawn traditionally, like having that as a foundation of trying to experience a 3-story arc, I feel like was really essential towards when I like taking everything I learned from that and then bringing that into my next story, which was Monster Heart. And Monster Heart, so during the pandemic and all conventions, all comic conventions are canceled. I was part of a drawing group that we'd meet up at like a particular day of the week, and we'd always be drawing and talking. And a friend started like joking about having like drawing a world that we all had characters in, and then we do our own stories, but in the same universe. And at the time, it was kind of more like Monster Hunter, like a hunter kind of character. But that drawing group really helped a lot with staying sane. And so it was going towards the end of 2020 that I realized I was not productive other than sketching. And I'm like, I must have something by the end of the year. So I gave myself a deadline of like thumbnailing out a story, which I did. And it's kind of like the same process for Monster Heart. The first book, City of Ruins, is like one giant prologue. That I saw like the beginning, the middle, and how it would end. And I thumbed out all of it, and in the beginning of 2021, I then gave myself the goal of like drawing out all the pages. It was a very different process than from Above the Clouds, where I was trying to push myself in a different way and being able to plan more ahead on how a story comes together versus just like, I'm going to sketch out the page, I'm gonna line it and color it, and final, done. This time I was like giving myself the flexibility to draw out the pages, like all of them, and then being able to like make it easier if I need to go back and shift things around to make the story stronger or tighter. So it started off on my Patreon as traditional pages. Yeah, then I went ahead and went back and I'm like, okay, I'm making this into a Webtoons vertical format. And I just kind of hopped in. And
which makes it more accessible for people to be introduced to your work. Now, the first part of Monster Heart is a large prologue, and then it time jumps many years later to a city that's like a mix between Zootopia and Monster Inc.
Mhm.
So, are you still going to be reusing some of those early characters?
Definitely, yeah, they're not going away. They have a big role to play. And so the main character of Monster Heart that it leads into towards the end, her name's Robin. And everything ties together, and just like Above the Clouds, there's some themes having to do with family that will make its way in there. Eva and Van, their story will be touched on more. Like I already have like 3 other books outlined, like, not like a full-on, like, planned out, but in my mind, I'm breaking it into, like, 3 other books, and I'm like, "Oh, yeah, down the line, like, their character's story will be talked about here." So, yeah, don't worry, there's gonna be more of these characters.
It's good to hear. I got sort of attached to them in the prologue, and I wasn't sure how long they might live. Like, a dragon, perhaps a shifter, might live for a long period, but humans are likely dead by this point.
Some of them, yes, and then some of them, like, I'm not gonna spoil anything, but I will say that magic has been flooding into the world, and so it's affecting humans as they haven't ever been affected by magic before.
So, we're going to take a bit of a pivot to talk about Webtoon formatting. So, when I read Above the Clouds, my initial impression was that you could very easily turn this into a webtoon. The way you already structured it had a very vertical type layout. So, for Monster Heart, which is a webtoon, did it take much effort to change it from a print comic format to a vertical layout?
It was definitely a lot of work because there's, like, a different width with doing a traditional page, and then when you're going to the format, that's on Webtoons, you'll see that even, like, the big, like, spread images that you would have doesn't necessarily fit exactly the way you'd want someone to receive the image, and so you have to do a little bit of reimagining with having it be in this vertical space, and then thinking about how what the viewer sees next interacts with those panels in a different way. And so oftentimes, like, it's amazing when it works out and I'm like, yeah, this is great. I can just like put it in. It feels like it flows really well. But you have times where it's just like awkward or something gets cut off to the left or the right, or it's just like a really weird transition. And there were a few times that I went ahead and just actually added more artwork to the web version, like just a little bit here and there. If someone was to like compare them side by side, they'd be able to see it.
I should do that. Compare them side to side. I wouldn't have guessed that you would have that kind of difficulty. But whatever you did it masterfully. One of the things I have also noticed on webtoons when people are starting off is they have difficulty with that sort of transition. For example, when the gutters, the space in between, where most print comics have this sort of very small space, or sometimes have, none. In webtoons, it is generally larger, so you can expand the gutter to create a different flow and pacing. However, I noticed that you created these sort of faded images and colored backgrounds within the transitory faces that kind of ties the different story panels together and adds a new level of artistry that I think is brilliant.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it's like trying to think about not just the the foreground, but the space in which the panel occupies the space, the foreground or the background. Um, it's just a lot of fun to play with because there's so much you can do with transitioning and what you want someone to feel as they're scrolling through. And like I remember before doing Monster Heart webcomic, I really like dived into looking at comic stories that are already being told in that format and seeing how they problem solved a lot of whatever story elements that they had to weave in. And like artists out there are so creative with how they go about it. And like I love the gradient feeling when you're scrolling because it starts in one space and then you get this nice gradient that goes down and then you're wondering what is that going to lead into, and like creating that question of why in the viewer feels important because it's almost like flipping a page when you're like at the last word and you're like what happens next and you have to like flip the page. And then so to see that happen in a vertical format where you like, especially with color, where you know it's leading into something and your mind automatically goes like what is this leading into. And so that's a really cool tool.
Yeah, it's almost like a completely different art form in the sort of palette you're able to use. I sometimes liken it to older style artistic scroll works like they use in Korea and Japan, where artists would draw on a long scroll piece of artwork that would eventually be displayed on a wall. And sometimes these scrolls would also be read as sequential stories. So, Webtoon's storyline and artistic format is almost like a modern form of classical Korean style hanging and hand scrolls. But, anyways, returning to Monster's Heart, one of the things I really like about your webtoon is that, unlike many, which I tend to just rapidly scroll through for the storyline or to produce that cinematic feel with the action panels, I pause on the panels in Monster's Heart and look at the detail and the backgrounds and how it flows and the watercolor like painting effects.
Hey. And I try to put in details where it's telling part of the story where it's just with the artwork and then it kind of adds like a transition to sometimes I'll layer over different actions that are happening in a story, but I use it as like a background element. So if someone wants to follow that character still of what they're doing, then it's there in the background as it leads to what's happening to characters in the foreground. It's a fun thing. There's this one comic artist that really inspired me. There's this old comic that I got at a comic, Orion, by Masamune Shiro, and he was really big on like you could read the main story and like follow that dialogue, but if you paid attention to the background, there were like these story elements just happening, which made it fun to absorb the panels that you were reading, and that always stayed with me. And so I've always been trying to incorporate that flow within my own panels too.
So, like a hidden story within a story?
Well, it's not necessarily a hidden story, but like you can get a sense of the world. Like if there's a protest going on, you'll see like people in the back holding signs and there's like stuff, or like they're having like a really mini conversation. It's kind of funny, but it's not necessary to like the overall. It just kind of gives a sense of like bigness to the world that the character is walking through.
For Monster Heart, I'm curious, what was it like working with the Webtoon format? What did you like about it? What did you dislike?
Sometimes I feel like for things that are horizontal, it's really fun being able to put a lot of details going across. And that was one of the things that was very frustrating for me, is that sometimes I'd have this like full on not vertical, horizontal panel. And when I went to put it into Webtoons, its format, I would have to like shrink it really tiny in order to like fit all of it in. But then like the impact of the image would be diminished. Like it shouldn't be experienced at this like really tiny scale. So you had to be creative with how you decided to fit the information in. Sometimes that was frustrating, just like stuff that, I mean, it's frustrating but understandable because the webtoon format is a vertical format, and so you have to really like play up the strengths of a vertical layout. Whereas a comic, you get to enjoy the range in both directions, I guess, depending on how you lay things out. So there was this one scene with Solveig. She's the character with the pink hair, and there's the scene where she's being attacked by an oncoming like monsters. Like a battle's about to happen, and I like really had fun illustrating this whole thing out, and then I had to figure out a way to put it in. And there was this other artist that said like, screw it, I'm not making it tiny, I'm just going to turn it sideways too. And so I was like, this is the perfect opportunity to try utilizing that. So I took that panel and I turned it sideways. I was thinking, would someone think it was weird going into it? But then I didn't mind it. And so I went ahead and went for that panel going like sideways, but then trying to alter it so it goes into this dark black gradient, so it like fades to this black. Then I could overlay other panels of what's happening. But yeah, it's one of those situations where you have to be pretty creative with how you decide to display the information of your illustration.
I think it's interesting how you shifted the horizontal panel into a vertical one to create that movement of falling.
Yeah, it's almost like the monsters are falling onto her. And so thankfully it kind of worked in that instance where I didn't have to get rid of all this volume of information, that expanded out. I could just go ahead and use the vertical. And I think I hope that people still, it didn't take them out of the story seeing the image shift in that direction.
I don't think that was really an issue. I mentioned this in lecture and other interviews. When seeing a horizontal panel in the vertical format, the readers on a smartphone can just, turn the phone to see it vertically, which is not that difficult to do, and perhaps only mildly disruptive. This is really only a problem if you're reading it on a computer. Nonetheless, I think the way you did it was even better because it goes beyond just transporting the horizontal scene into a vertical one, but it actually utilizes that verticality and creates an extra dimension of movement that can be realized more effectively. This is because your hand movement when swiping downward sort of like reinforces that visual element of seeing the image falling. So it almost creates the feel of the movement falling when you are scrolling downward.
Yes, yeah. The movement is a very important aspect of comics. Even in traditional formats, you'll notice that I've heard people say about how, like, when you end a panel on the second page, you don't want someone facing like this way usually because it makes it feel like a stopping point. So usually, if you pay attention, a lot of characters will be facing in a direction that makes it feel like it's leading off the page, that makes you then want to flip it. And so even in traditional formats, you're very aware of the flow of how your eyes will travel from one panel to the next. And so respecting the medium, the webcomic of it going downwards, thinking about the action that's happening. In that instance of these monsters bearing down on Solveig, then it made sense to to problem solve with flipping it, because it still gave you that same feeling. Now, if someone were to tilt like an image sideways, you'd have to like really think about like how are you feeling as you're experiencing this image. Like, do you feel like a stopping point? Do you feel like someone's gonna scroll down and continue their eyes journeying on? So it's like just being aware of the feeling that someone has as they're going through your webcomic. And it's so amazing how little things can impact someone's feeling of what they're looking at. Because sometimes you'll see an image and there's like this really hard, like horizontal line that kind of feels like a stopping point almost. And then you're like, oh, okay. But then like you keep going, but you have that moment where you have to think about that line, like that feeling of a stopping point. And part of what I'm trying to learn as a storyteller in a comic and in a web version is how do I remove as many points that make someone pause and question what they're looking at. So if they have to think about like what's going on right here, the person's going out of the story. And if they're getting out of the story, that's one more opportunity for them to say no to your story and then move on to something else. So it's like removing as many barriers as possible. And that's something I'm still trying to be better at, is stop like being able to tell as clear of a story where someone doesn't question what they're reading. Like the part about the walkie-talkie, someone had to stop and go, whoa, that doesn't make sense. Like they wouldn't be saying that right there, and they're instantly like out of the story because they have to question the thing that they're reading about. And so like that's why I appreciated this person took time to like, because many people will read a thing and be like, oh, that doesn't make sense, move on.
And this is why you need to go to Melissa's Patreon and not only support her, but give her helpful feedback.
I love you.
And once again, I must commend you for the added design elements that help the movement flow downward, whether it's through the placement of dialogue, the shading elements within the gutter, or the scene overlays.
Yeah. It doesn't take much to do that too. Sometimes just like really small elements, or I've seen someone just do like a ribbon going down. It makes a big impact than just having white space, because it creates this flow with someone's eye. Like it doesn't have to be complicated. I mean, because I understand it takes a lot of work to put a web comic, any kind of comic, together, which is why I don't fault people for doing like using the 3D models and learning Blender and creating up their scenes. Like if it frees up time to focus on the story and make it amazing, like don't get in their way, don't question their like let them put the story together how they need to get moving forward. And like they're like sometimes like there's this purist attitude like I must draw ever. I mean, if you're able to and you have the time, but as I get older and you start having less time.
Definitely. So what is your process in publishing on Webtoon from start to finish? Do you have any software? Do you mainly do line drawing or hand drawing?
So Monster Heart is completely digital, and I use my Intuos tablet because I'm having a hard time wanting to switch to like a Cintiq where you're drawing on the screen. Like I built up the hand-eye coordination. That took a lot of years. But I use my Intuos tablet and I do all of my work in Photoshop. I used to use a lot of Corel Painter when I did my illustrations, but all my images usually end up in Photoshop because their output level is a little bit better with the colors or trying to like shift the hues. And then because I work so long on Above the Clouds and trying to streamline my my process to be more efficient, I just kept everything in Photoshop. And I've been working in that for so long that it's kind of hard to switch because I'm a creature of habit, I guess. So I'm not saying it's the best because I know there's lots of programs people love using that they recommend. I just stay in Photoshop because at the moment it's easier for me to like be in my familiar playing ground. And so I thumbnail and sketch out everything in Photoshop, and then I go back and I take those thumbnails and I start trying to arrange it in a way that helps tell a better story. And so I'll replot it again in a new page with the intention of this is the comic. I usually work in spreads. I don't work page by page because, and this is going back to, I started Monster Heart with the idea of printing it first, or a traditional format, and it being able to be back and forth. So I think of everything as a spread first, how your eyes go from one page to the next page. And so I like seeing both at once. And so I usually work 2 pages at a time then, with laying out thumbnails and then going back, trying to do a draft of those lines first. And then once I have like a good feeling, I'm like, hey, this is telling the story the way I want it to flow, I go back and then I do the final lines and then do my color work. And I have a lot of the process I've shown up on my TikTok account too, of it going from start to finish.
So, if you want to find out more about her process, go visit Melissa's TikTok channel. Now, I think it was a good idea that you thought about the 2 different types of formats, both print and digital, while creating your webtoon. Because if you want to make some extra revenue, or if you get a large enough crowd following your work, they will watch that print version most likely. And quite frankly, you can't sign a webtoon. So one of the things I like to do is to get the first edition of a comic, if anything, just to see how it was converted to print format.
Yeah. Yeah, and it becomes really apparent when they haven't planned for both formats. And I get it's really easy to just go straight to the web and plan for that, and it's a lot quicker. But the vertical format, when you put it on a webcomic, I mean, a traditional printed version, it's just like a very different medium with how your eyes flow. And I wanted to respect both mediums, both a traditional and a web. And the problem that I'm seeing some artists come to is that they finish their webcomic, they want to go print it, and they have these panels the way it's spread out on the page, and you see this very unintentional white space. Like your eyes can't help but like feel the white space that's surrounding these panels, which to me takes me out of the story. Where like when I was reading it on a web version, I just like scrolled through it fast. I'm like, yeah, I gotta read the story, this is great. But you don't have that same feeling when you're flipping a page. Like you're gonna be like, you will be sitting with it and you're gonna feel the weight of how much white that you're looking at. And so, I mean, that's my recommendation. I would start, if you intend to print it, I would start with a traditional, like it's more work. Definitely going to be a lot more work, but if you start with a traditional page, it's much easier to go from a traditional and then reformat it going into a vertical format. And then you're ready for when you do decide to make a book, they get to experience your story. Like if they're first, they come across your story first on Webtoons and they read it in a vertical format, it's almost its own story, and they get to re-experience the whole thing again in a traditional format, which means it's going to feel brand new to them all over again. It's like you're offering almost one story, but it feels like 2 almost, because they get to like have both. And then, you know, if they preferred the web or they want to experience it differently on the web, they can go back and forth between them. But
I completely agree with you that it's difficult to make that leap from webtoon to print format. Many artists have difficulty with this. I haven't read all print versions of webtoons, but I can say that probably the most egregious transference is from actually one of my favorite webtoons, Noblesse. In the webtoon format, this was an excellent sci-fi action comic with a good mix of long and short panel designs, and the spacing was generally well done. However, in print format, it had so much white space. I was like, did somebody just copy and paste the panels onto a blank white piece of paper? And they didn't do any major formatting to make it look like a comic book. It had almost zero design, and it looked like they just wanted to throw something together to make a few extra dollars. I never really saw the later editions because I didn't buy it. So it could have been improved on. And Noblesse, well, it did come out in 2009. So it was one of the first action webtoons created. Therefore, they didn't have much experience in converting into the print medium. So, well, after that big rant, I just want to say that new artists should always take that advice that when creating a webtoon to keep in mind the possibility of in the future making a print version.
And perhaps there is a webcomic artist who started first with the web version and then went to traditional. I'm curious as to their problem solving. I'm sure it's totally possible. It just depends on where you want to, like, it's like the energy up front or towards the end, because it makes a big impression on me when someone is intentional with the space that they use in the medium that they're creating. So when they take their webcomic and put it in a printed format that my mind makes sense of how the panels are flowing together, and that instead of it just feeling like you were saying how it feels like they're just kind of like plopping it in, and it's like, well, I don't know how to fix this, so I mean, they like the story, I guess they'll just like to me, I don't know, it makes me sad. It makes me a little bit sad because I've seen stories where like they're really great, but then it's like I don't want to experience the sea of white that's going on.
I have noticed that this has improved over the years as editors became more familiar with converting webtoons into print. For instance, I recently purchased a copy of Magical Boy by The Cow. When I spoke to him, he mentioned that he made all of his works digitally for the webtoon format, and then later he was asked to make a print version. So he was a bit nervous about how it would turn out. But, I must admit, the editor did an excellent job. They really did a good job at creating that verticality, the flow, the pacing between the panels. I didn't notice any area with problematic white space. Instead, they did, techniques very much like yours, where they added color and shading into the backgrounds to erase that white space and make it less stark. Therefore, might depend on the editor. Still, as an artist, it's probably not good to just hope that your editor is good enough to convert it properly.
Yeah. As long as they feel intentional in how they're moving forward with the medium that they're using. That's all I like. Forethought was put into.
So I'm curious, have you noticed any differences in the audience responses and viewership commentaries between Above the Clouds and Monster Heart?
Sure. So there's some similarities and differences. Like when I was putting up on Patreon, the benefit of doing it that way was that they were awesome in being able to help point out any errors, especially like spelling errors or if something is inconsistent. Or I'm like, oh, thank you so much. Because I mean, you look at something for so long, and then like everything just kind of, I don't know. So, and it's kind of similar on Webtoons, where some of the stuff that was missed for my patrons, you have a bigger audience that's coming across it. And for instance, I got the walkie-talkie lingo incorrect. And so someone's like, oh, hey, if you wanted to be more real with how someone talks on a walkie-talkie, you'd probably be saying this. And I'm like, thank you. Because like I'm able to then go back, and I mean, the great thing about Webtoons is that even if you post it, you can still go back and re-upload images and add in edits and changes, which I love because then it makes it a stronger story, which means I have to go back now to my traditional pages and edit those when I go to print. What's fun about, again, you have a bigger audience, I think, on Webtoons, and so I'm having more people, like once they come across it, they get into the story. And so it's fun as watching a few people where they're commenting as they're reading, going through each episode, like, oh no, something's happened here, or like it's fun being able to experience it in a way with them as they're going through each episode, because they'll just like binge like a whole bunch of episodes at once, and I'm like, oh, I love how they're experiencing the story, or they're like, oh, I wonder if this X, Y, and Z is gonna happen, or trying to guess with things. And to me, that's the fun part. At least when I'm super into stories, like I start coming up with weird theories, like what does this mean over here? Maybe down the line that will lead to something happening. And then like being able to like fan over with other people who are like, oh, I didn't see that detail. I wonder what that means. And so if I could somehow experience or be able to create that experience for someone else, that's so rad. So,
That's one of my favorite things about reading webtoons as well, looking at people's comments.
yeah, that's what's fun about the comments, is seeing how other people are like, oh, I wonder if they dislike this girl too, this one character. And I have to go through the comments. I'm like, that's right, this person.
I never thought of this before, but you could just make your disliked characters into demons later. And in this way, they're almost embody like an illustrative manifestation of audience inks. So, well, jokes aside, I think we're moving towards the end of our conversation. Therefore, to wrap it up, I would like to ask if you have any concluding thoughts to share with our audience on upcoming projects or anything else.
Yeah. So the Above the Clouds, the first story that I did, is in this hardcover edition. It got picked up by Wonderbound, which is the kids line for Webcomics, and that's coming out as a softcover edition next year. And I'm really excited about that book coming out because there's gonna be a new cover. I'm adding actually a couple more pages. Nothing that you would miss out on if you read this. It just sort of adds like a layer to make it feel a little bit more special, especially for the people who've supported me along the way. And other than that, I'm Teacup Bee. You can find me on Twitter, TikTok. That's my username handle. So hope you stop by and say hi.
Thank you so much for joining us, and it was a pleasure talking with you.
It's a lot of fun talking with you. Thanks for having me on.
For those watching, please check out Monster Heart and Above the Clouds. You can find the links in the description below. And if you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe for further content. Also, don't forget, not every artist starts off as a genius, but they all have the potential to become one. Thank you, and see you on the next installment of Webtoon Genius.